we're going to transition to a second panel. And for those that are just joining us, this is the People's Hearing on Immigration Enforcement. We're hearing from different panelists to discuss what is happening, what has happened, and is continuing to happen in Minnesota. So we'll go ahead and transition. So this next panel regarding national immigration enforcement, detention, and civil rights impacts examines how local enforcement practices connect to the broader national immigration enforcement and detention system. Many arrests that have been carried out here in Minnesota ultimately end up in detention facilities located far from the communities where individuals live and work. Families have reported loved ones being transferred to detention centers in other states, including Texas, my home state, to facilities like Dilley and Camp East, Montana. We've heard testimony to that effect from earlier, and advocates have raised serious concerns about conditions, and they continue to raise those concerns within those facilities, including access to medical care, legal representation, and the ability of families to maintain contact with detained relatives. So this panel is going to examine how local cases may influence national legal developments, including ongoing debates surrounding expedited deportations and due process protections. These issues highlight how enforcement actions in a single city can ripple across the national immigration system. So it's not just local, it impacts the entire country. So each panelist, you have 5 to 7 minutes to present your testimony. We have before us Arti Kohli, the Executive Director of Asian Law Caucus, Raha Walla, the Vice President of the National Immigration Law Center, and we have Daniel Hatum, the Senior Supervising Attorney from the Beyond Borders program at the Texas Civil Rights Project. So we can go ahead and start with Arti, if you want to kick us off.
Sure. Thank you, Commissioner Garza, the Miranda family, and all of the local partners for having me here. And before I say anything else, I want to acknowledge everyone in this room and across Minnesota who is showing up for each other. My name is Arti Kohli. I'm the Executive Director of the Asian Law Caucus, the nation's first civil rights organization for Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. We are a law, policy, and impact litigation organization. We fight in federal courts. We help shape policy at the state and national level, and we work in coalition with organizations across the country. Some of our founders were children of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. They built this organization because they knew what happens when a government decides an entire community is the enemy. They also knew that communities who organize, who document, who refuse to be silent, those are the communities that prevail. So I want to start today with a story about a man named Nurul Amin Shah Alam. Nurul was a 56-year-old Rohingya Muslim refugee from Burma, a member of a community the United States government has recognized as survivors of genocide. He had been in this country legally since December 2024. He was nearly blind. He spoke little English. One day, Nurul went to buy a curtain rod to use as a walking stick. On his way home, he ended up on the wrong porch. The homeowner called the police. The police arrested him without providing an interpreter, without making any real effort to understand who he was or what had happened. A nearly blind refugee with a curtain rod was criminalized because no one bothered to find out the truth. He was held at the Erie County facility in Buffalo. He was then moved over to Border Patrol. Border Patrol eventually realized that he was not subject to deportation. But instead of calling his family or his lawyer, they dropped him off alone at a Tim Hortons 5 miles from his home. In freezing weather, telling no one. 5 days later, his body was found near a hockey arena in downtown Buffalo. Border Patrol bears ultimate responsibility. They are the ones who left a vulnerable man alone in the cold. But the chain of failure started earlier, with a police encounter that provided no interpreter, no understanding, no basic humanity. At every step, someone could have made a different choice. That is the story of what is happening nationally. A system of choices made deliberately that strips people of their dignity and their rights. Everyone in this country is entitled to due process, not as a privilege, as a right. And this administration is dismantling it step by step. I will come back to Noral's story at the end. And what I've heard today is what I know is to be true. What is happening in Minnesota is part of a deliberate national pattern. You all know this. You've been living it, organizing against it, and documenting it with remarkable courage. What I want to add is that I do see something shifting. Americans across the country are starting to ask hard questions about what their government is actually doing. Courts are pushing back. Whistleblowers are coming forward. The more we connect what is happening in Minnesota to that national reckoning, the harder it becomes for this administration to operate in the dark. So I'm going to talk briefly about how detention is being used as a weapon. The detained population has grown 75% in the past year. Over 68,000 people in a system that is deliberately inhumane. 30 people died in ICE detention in 2025. It's the deadliest year on record, and I have no doubt that unfortunately 2026 will be worse. The oversight offices that used to exist have been gutted. I was actually involved in the case of a 73-year-old Indian grandmother transferred overnight from California to Georgia, away from her family and her lawyer. She was vegetarian. When she asked for food for her medication, they gave her cubes of ice. She slept on a cement block, and they transported her back to India in shackles on over a 20-hour flight. The detention system is designed to break people down until they agree to leave. So many operate without a lawyer, without understanding what they're signing, hundreds of miles away from their families. So a case in Minnesota was of a man named Oscar, who a judge had actually ordered to be released. Even after a judge had ordered his release, ICE was pressuring him to self-deport. And because he had been able to communicate with family and know that he had been ordered released, he resisted signing the papers. But it's not because ICE told him. And so this is happening over and over again. There is constant misrepresentation and outright lies. ICE is now purchasing empty warehouses across the country and converting them into detention facilities. These are warehouses for keeping boxes, like an Amazon warehouse. Communities across the country will be asked to issue permits for turning these facilities to now warehouse human beings. They will have choices. This will become also a local decision. And so I want communities to understand you have a say in this. The next point I want to talk about is, we've talked a lot today about the Constitution, but I want to add a little bit more. There is deliberate top-down lawlessness happening within this administration. The administration is fully aware that they are violating the Constitution. A former ICE attorney resigned and testified before Congress that ICE leadership issued a memo instructing agents that they could enter people's homes using an administrative warrant, a document that has no judicial authority and that doesn't meet the Fourth Amendment standard. That instruction directly contradicted the written training materials that ICE had, and they refused to give their own staff copies of that memo. But they wanted them to teach ICE trainees that they could break down people's doors. They knew it was unconstitutional, but they taught it anyway. Federal judges, including Judge Blackwell right here in Minnesota, have ordered people released and watched those orders get ignored. People who show up to document or protest immigration enforcement are being charged with assaulting federal officers, and you all have talked about this earlier today. But the important thing to remember is the vast majority of charges do not hold up. But we know what the goal is. The goal is not necessarily conviction. The goal is silence. And there are myriad ways they are attacking the Constitution. We are co-counsel in Barbara v. Trump, the birthright citizenship case before the Supreme Court. The administration is attempting to end birthright citizenship, which is enshrined in the 14th Amendment, by executive order. This is a right that has existed for the entirety of the United States, but for over 150 years for all Americans. We have won a nationwide injunction, and we will be in front of the Supreme Court on April 1st. And it is very, very important that all Americans show up to fight for not just the right for birthright citizenship, but for all the different rights that we've talked about today, including due process. So what can communities do? I'm just going to name 4 things. I'm sure there are many more. First, know how your local police interacts with ICE. Nurul's story didn't begin with the Border Patrol. It began with a police officer who didn't call an interpreter, and a system that criminalized a man rather than helping him. That local failure handed him to the federal system. Your law enforcement must provide interpretation, must adhere to due process, and cannot engage in racial profiling. Your tax dollars do not have to fund a pipeline from local police to federal immigration enforcement. To all Americans, find out where your city, county, and state stand and hold them accountable. Second, if ICE tries to place a detention facility in your community, fight it. Demand inspection rights. Make them answer for what happens inside. This is a local decision with national consequences. Third, follow the money. Operation Metro Surge here in the Twin Cities cost an estimated $18 million a week, while people in many states cannot afford groceries, gas, or a doctor's visit. Ask your elected officials what you are buying with that money and whether it is making anyone safer. Fourth, and certainly not least, fund legal defense, including habeas representation, A habeas petition forces the government to bring a person before a court and justify why they are being held. It is one of the oldest constitutional protections we have. It is what has gotten numerous members of our families and communities out before they are been transferred away from us. There are not enough lawyers filing them right now, and this is something that communities can help fix. I've also heard today that communities across this state have trained 50,000 constitutional observers. People who show up, who bear witness, who document what is happening so that it cannot be denied or erased. And we all know those observers have faced retaliation for doing so. That tells you everything you need to know about what this administration fears. It fears you. Our founders built the Asian Law Caucus in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement. They knew that the arc of this country bends towards justice only when people force it to bend. You are those people. We see you from California, we see you from across the country, and we know that you are not going anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair Garza, for convening this people's hearing on the civil and human rights violations of Operation Metro Surge. My name is Raha Walla. I'm the Vice President for Strategy and Partnerships at the National Immigration Law Center. For nearly a half century, National Immigration Law Center, also known as NILC, has fought to advance justice and protect the rights of low-income immigrant communities across the United States. We do federal advocacy, strategic campaigns, and importantly, we work to empower immigrants and the organizations that represent them to understand their rights and then fight for more just laws and policies at the federal, state, and local levels. Though I live in Washington, D.C., I am actually a native Minnesotan, proudly so, I might add, and I come from a family of refugees and immigrants. I'm also a human rights lawyer who specializes in how governments abuse national security and emergency powers to undermine rights. So if there's one thing my experience has taught me, it's this. The path to authoritarianism is being built on the back of immigrants right now. And the shocking attacks against Minnesotans and so many other communities across the country are proof positive that we are indeed well on our way and have arrived. I just want to make a few points and then I'd be happy to answer any questions. First, as been said many times today, all people within the United States have constitutional rights, irrespective of their immigration status. But importantly, when the basic rights are violated for non-citizens, they erode the rights of all Americans. The shocking, senseless murders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy were not an accident, but rather the predictable result of a year of cruel and lawless immigration enforcement policy that has resulted in the illegal and unconstitutional searches, arrests, home invasions, detentions, deportations, and even deaths of Americans, undocumented immigrants, and immigrants with status and work authorization alike. Here during Operation Metro Surge, Minnesotans, including U.S. citizens, have been stopped, arrested, and in some cases detained for hours or days based on little more than the color of their skin, the clothes they wear, the job they work in, the people they're hanging out with, the language they're speaking or the accent they're speaking it in, or just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This papers, please approach to immigration enforcement by stereotype reflects national policy of racial profiling that played out in LA, Chicago, DC, and many other cities before it was supercharged here in the Twin Cities. Operation Metro Surge also showed that people are not safe even in their own homes. In January, federal agents brandished assault rifles instead of a warrant and used a battering ram to break down the door of a Minneapolis home to arrest Garrison Gribson, a Liberian Minnesotan man who fled civil war as a refugee when he was a child and remains here lawfully. A whistleblower complaint alleges that ICE recruits are being trained to pursue warrantless home invasions as we speak, in violation of the Fourth Amendment. A tactic that we saw on shocking display in Chicago last fall when federal agents claiming they were on a counterterrorism mission descended from a Black Hawk helicopter into an apartment complex, stormed in with flashbang grenades, and broke into people's homes in a military-style operation that resulted in the unlawful arrest and detention of dozens of men, women, and children, many of whom were U.S. citizens. Which brings me to my second point. The administration is offering false counterterrorism, foreign policy, and national security justifications to attempt to justify the unjustifiable and unlock war and emergency powers that are being used to disproportionately target Black, brown, and indigenous people, as well as other racial and ethnic minorities. It's no accident, I think it goes without saying, it's been said earlier today, it's no accident that ICE's surge to Minneapolis originated with a racist attack on the Minnesotan Somali community that in many ways harkens back to President Trump's Muslim and African bans, which have been dramatically expanded to include 75 countries that have predominantly Black, brown, Muslim, or Asian populations. The National Immigration and Law Center and many of our friends have litigated these issues over the years, and we're continuing to fight this expanded ban in courts as well. And we have debunked the cynical smears against the Minnesota Somali community that continue to this day. It's also why we started the Democracy Defense Initiative, to protect immigrant rights by defending democracy and defend our democracy by protecting immigrant rights. And that includes fighting back against the militarization of our immigration policy, which is why we sued to successfully block the deployment of the National Guard to police the people of Memphis. Third point I want to make is the outrageous arrest and detention of 5-year-old Minnesotan Liam Conejo Ramos is not a one-off. It's a reflection of a national policy that specifically and intentionally targets children and families in a cynical effort to promote self-deportation by imposing maximum suffering. That's why NILC has successfully prevented the administration from violating the due process rights of unaccompanied Guatemalan children and deporting them overnight in the hundreds over Labor Day weekend. And it's also why we've partnered with the National Education Association and many others to stand up a national campaign to protect the constitutional right of every child to a free public K-12 education, irrespective of their immigration status. One more depressing point, and then a positive one I'm going to close on. Despite all these successes in courts, not just from the National Immigration Law Center, but also limiting partners who have spoken today, we can't really expect the law, at least as it currently exists, on the books now to fully protect our rights. What I didn't say about the national policy of racial profiling in immigration enforcement is that it was in fact blessed by the Supreme Court. And even where the law is clear, the administration is increasingly violating it in defiance of court orders. A federal judge right here in Minnesota has documented hundreds of violations of court orders in Operation Metro Surge, which reflects a policy of disdain for our system of checks and balances coming from the senior-most levels of the Department of Justice, even the president himself. And here's the hopeful note that I close on. Minnesotans have proven that they will not let their rights be taken from them, despite what the courts say, despite what the government says, and that they will put their own lives at risk to protect their communities. They ended Operation Metro Surge. I want to say that again. It wasn't the Trump administration that ended it. It was Minnesotans that ended Operation Metro Surge. They shut down DHS in Congress, and they have forced a long overdue national reckoning on the militarization of immigration enforcement and domestic policing that has been threatening the very foundation of civil and human rights protections in the United States for decades. Thank you.
Thank you. Daniel, we can go to you.
Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. These are the immortal words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., speaking about the civil rights movement in the 1960s. But when we look to the immigrants' rights landscape today, they're equally applicable, and that's why I'm here. My name is Daniel Hatoum, and I'm an attorney from Texas working for the Texas Civil Rights Project. But it's because I'm just some Southern lawyer that I've seen the far-range effects that Metro Surge has had everywhere in this country. And so I'm here today to testify about that interconnectedness that we have with our neighbors in the north. And I'm going to focus on two specific points to do so. First, how civil rights violations that existed along the US-Mexico border were exported from Texas to Minnesota. And second, how the civil rights violations that occurred in Minnesota ultimately became imported to Texas. But first, I want to talk about the US-Mexico border and what has been occurring along the US-Mexico border for years. Specifically, within 100 miles of the US-Mexico border, many courts have passed off on this idea that it is a constitutional light zone, that Customs and Border Protection, officers of the Department of Homeland Security, can search folks without a warrant. It shouldn't be lost on us now that the people who led Operation MetroServe were folks who were trained along the US-Mexico border. Greg Bovino is someone who was both a CBP officer and had his start in El Paso, Texas. And what we saw with them bringing these tactics to Minnesota. For example, very quickly into the beginning of the surge, we saw memorandums that were being published that said that CBP officers and ICE agents could enter people's homes without a warrant. And this is not just some esoteric legal discussion. This had real effects on real people. Mr. Tao is an individual who lives here in Minnesota and was seen early with his family one morning when armed agents entered his home without a judicial warrant. They pointed guns at his family, and before he even had the opportunity to get dressed, they dragged him into the snow, only to find out that he was a U.S. citizen. When we allow constitutional violations, and when we create a culture of impunity around searches, such that there is no third-party warrant requirement, anyone can become a victim of these actions by CBP and ICE. But it's not just searches, it's also excessive force. For decades, the Supreme Court has adopted something of a cottage industry of passing on excessive force when it's conducted by CBP in the name of national security. And what we saw with Operation MetroSurge was them continuing the tactics that they had long used and the culture that had been created along the US-Mexico border. Members of CBP were throwing flash grenades into crowds of people practicing their constitutional rights to protest. And it should not be lost on us that the individuals who swarmed and killed Alex Preddy were CBP agents. But it's not just about how those civil rights violations were exported from Texas to Minnesota, but how ICE and CBP then exported the civil rights violations that they were committing here and sent them to Texas. During the first panel, one of the things that we heard was this idea that being sent to Texas was synonymous with being thrown in a cell with terrible conditions and detained for long periods of time. And during Operation MetroSurge, one of the things that I heard from lawyers who reached out to me was that they were essentially arresting folks in Minnesota and immediately putting them on a bus to Texas. And that was happening for two reasons. One, Texas has the largest amount of detention beds in the country. And two, Texas has one of the most conservative judicial apparatus in the country. So when people want to litigate their habeas petitions, they're going to be met with a much more difficult court of appeals in Texas than they would in Minnesota or in other states where the administration was arresting folks. There are two detention facilities that I want to focus on where many people were being sent. The Dilley Detention Facility, the family detention facility, and Camp East Montana at Fort Bliss that I'll refer to as Camp East. We've already heard a lot about Dilley today. It was one of the facilities, or is the facility where Liam Conejo Ramos was sent. It's because it's a family detention facility, a type of facility that advocates refer to as baby jails, because it's surreal to walk into a private prison and hear an infant crying. And these facilities are famous for their awful conditions of confinement. Harvard University did a study in which they found that the provision of medical care in the Dilley facility was woefully inadequate. And in fact, during the first Trump administration, a child that was held in the Dilley facility ultimately passed as a result of the lack of medical care they received while inside. And while Dilley is certainly notorious is an understatement when we're referring to Camp East Montana at Fort Bliss. Camp East is a former site of Japanese internment. When we look at the conditions in that facility, what we see is a lack of medical care being the rule, putrid food that causes widespread sickness, diarrhea, and vomiting, and excessive force where beatings are a common occurrence. In fact, there was a recent death at Camp East Montana at Fort Bliss, and the medical examiner that examined that death ruled that it was a homicide. Let me be clear about what that means. The medical examiner was saying that the guards at that facility strangled a man to death. Another death that also occurred within a month of that death was of an individual from Minnesota who we still don't have answers on. And because of the amount of enforcement and the amount of folks that were being sent to these detention facilities, it contributed to overcrowding, which led to other medical issues, such as measles outbreaks in the facilities, that threaten not just the facilities themselves, but the entire communities that they're in and communities that they communicate with. Campus Montana is in El Paso, a city of over 700,000 people with a busy airport and people flying all over the country every day. When we allow injustices to occur elsewhere, they end up in our communities and they harm our people, our neighbors. And I want to go back and end, though, with this thought of interconnectedness and what it means. It doesn't just mean that the bad things that happen in one place go elsewhere, but it also means that when we stand up for our immediate neighbors, we help people all over the country. To point out a quote that one of our other co-panelists talked about, this idea that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, but only if we're willing to bend it. When the folks of Minnesota stood up and they forced Operation Metro Surge to end by standing hand in hand with their neighbors, they provided a blueprint to all of us to stand up for our neighbors so that we can help people in all parts suffering injustice. The only thing left for us to do is to follow it.
Thank you, David.
I thank you guys so much. I'm really touched by everything that you've said here today, and it kind of brings it full circle of what we've been hearing from earlier panels and what we're going to pivot to and hear directly from impacted folks. But I don't have a ton of questions. I don't know if there's any last comments that you all have, but I think my main takeaways from this panel is supporting habeas corpus, right, which is a process for getting somebody out of detention, and that process also depends on where you're located, so what state you're in and what kind of judge you pull, and that all of this is interconnected. Those are the main takeaways that I have, is that what happens in Minnesota is really happening to all of us across this country. So thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your comments, and I look forward to hearing more from you as we move forward. We're going to take a quick break, have some lunch, and then reconvene at 3. So maybe 20-minute break.